All right, here we go. We're on chapter 5, The City and the Sand. Ooh. Just as a recap, last time we talked about, basically, this here. Last time we talked about how people change their own look and view according to the subcategories that they like to identify with. Hence, I brought in the modern examples of purple hair and nose rings versus red hats, big trucks, and big flags. And how when the Nephites talk about skin of white and skin of black, it's not a racist thing. It's just showing that they marked themselves, A, and B, that it has a lot to do with just identifying with whatever subgroup you were in. And besides, if you really read the Book of Mormon, you understand that the Lamanites end up being more righteous than the Nephites, which I think is a great warning to anyone who's in the church. Next, we had the place names in the desert. We talked about Nahum and how families will name different places in the desert and how that's natural, and talked about different rivers of water versus rivers of sand, and how that all worked. Now, we are in the city and the sand. Lehi the poet. The powerful speech by which alone Lehi kept his rebellious sons in line is a gift demanded of every real sheik in the desert, and indeed against the proud and touchy Bedouins, that is the only weapon the sheik possesses. For, as we have seen, he may not use force. The true leader, says an ancient Arab poetess, was not one to keep silent when the contest of words began. When the men assemble in the chief's tent to take counsel together, the leader addresses the whole assembly in a succession of wise counsels intermingled with opportune proverbs, exactly in the manner of Lehi, with his endless parables. People of any other country hearing them speak, says our informant, would simply suppose them filled with a supernatural gift. Poetical exclamations rose all around me, Burton recalls, showing how deeply tinged with imagination becomes the language of the Arab under the influence of strong passion or religious enthusiasm. Let us visit the tent of Lehi. I returned to the tent of my father, says Nephi, and I beheld my brethren, and they were disputing one with another concerning the things which my father had spoken unto them. And after I had received strength, I spake unto my brethren. And after I, Nephi, had made an end of speaking to my brethren, they did humble themselves before the Lord. Great is the power of speech among the desert people, and if Lehi's language sounds strangely exclamatory and high-flown to us, it is because it is of the ancient pattern, by the Spirit of the Lord, which was in our fathers. Moreover, Lehi was a poet, and there is no more remarkable passage in the Book of Mormon than the eloquent little verses which he, on one memorable occasion, addressed to his wayward sons. It was just after the first camp had been pitched, with due care for the performance of the proper thanksgiving rites at the altar of stones, that Lehi, being then free to survey the scene more at his leisure, for among the desert people it is the women who make and break camp, though the sheik must officiate in the sacrifice, proceed, as was his right, to name the river after his firstborn son and the valley after his second son. The men examined the terrain more closely, as Arabs always do after pitching camp in a place where they expect to spend some time, and discover that the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea. At a point near the mouth thereof, which suggests the Gulf of Aqaba, at a point not far above the Straits of Tiran, when Lehi beheld the view, perhaps from the sides of Mount Musafa or Mount Mendisha, he turned to his two elder sons and recited his remarkable verse. Nephi seems to have been standing by, for he takes most careful note of the circumstance. And when my father saw that the waters of the river emptied into the fountain of the Red Sea, he spake unto Laman, saying, O that thou mightest be like unto this river, continually running into the fountain of all righteousness. And he also spake unto Lemuel, Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this valley, firm and steadfast, and immovable in keeping the commandments of the Lord. That's 1 Nephi 2, 9 and 10. No subject has been more intensively studied over a greater number of years than that of primitive Semitic poetry, and nowhere could one find a more perfect illustration of the points that are now agreed upon as to the nature and form of the original's article than in this brief account of Nephi's. First, there is the occasion. It was the sight of the river flowing into the Gulf, which inspired Lehi to address his sons. In a famous study, Goldseer pointed out that the earliest desert poems ever mentioned, those of the Quellenlidir, songs composed of fresh water, which, according to the records of St. Nilus, the ancient Arabs used to intone after having refreshed and washed themselves in some fountain of running water, discovered in the course of a long journeying. Nilus's own account is a vivid picture of what Lehi's party went through. The next day, after making their way as usual into the desert by devious routes, wandering over the difficult terrain, forced to turn aside now this way, now that, circumventing mountains, stumbling over rough, broken ground through all but impenetrable passes, they beheld in the far distance a spot of green in the desert, and striving to reach the vegetation by which the oasis might provide a camp or even sustain a settlement for some of them, we are reading Nomadicon, for the senseless Monadicon. So, Nomadicon for the senseless Monadicon. Not sure what those words are or mean in the context of this quote, but as they conjectured, they turned their eyes towards it as a storm-tossed pilot views the harbor. Upon reaching it, they found that the spot did not disappoint their expectations, and that their wishful fantasies had not led them to false hopes. For the water was abundant, clean to the sight, and sweet to the taste, so that it was a question whether the eye or the mouth was the more rejoiced. Moreover, there was adequate forage for the animals, so they unloaded the camels and let them out to graze freely. For themselves, they could not let the water alone, drinking, splashing, and bathing, as if they could not revel in it enough. So they recited songs in its praise, the rivers, and composed hymns to the spring. So you can see how it's very much a lifeline and cultural centerpiece. Now, there was a footnote over here with actual information, not just a bunch of references. This was in reference to the sides of Mount, when Lehi was beholding these different mountains. And it says, the river would flow between these two elevations, as indicated on maps of the area. The valley seems to be commodious enough. We suggest an investigation. From the most ancient times, it has been the custom of travelers in the desert to inscribe their names on the rocks at such places where they have encamped. It is almost certain that Lehi's people left their marks at the more important stopping places. So he unibly suggests, hey, we should probably look all through that valley between those two mountains and see if Lehi left anything that we can actually trace. That'd be incredible if we did, because the desert has a funny way of not changing at all for a long time and then suddenly changing, depending on flash floods and such. So depending on where and how they made their mark, it could be if they did it up on the side of a hill, like a lot of petroglyphs and petroglyphs, they etched into the rock on the side of the hills in the canyonlands. And so those are preserved. But if you were to just write your name on a rock wall that's down near the riverbed, when the flash floods come, that might be scoured clean, or the rock might become loose and tumbled out of existence, etc. So anyways, after that quote about them reveling in the river, Ibn Qutayba, in a famous work on Arabic poetry, quoted a great desert poet, Abu Sakr, saying that nothing on earth brings verses so readily to mind as the sight of running water and wild places. This applies not only to springs, of course, but to all running water. Thomas recounts how his Arabs, upon reaching the al-Hayt, hailed it with a song in praise of the continuous and flowing rain, whose bounty filled the bed of the Wadi, flowing along between sands and stream course. Just so Lehi holds up as the most admirable of examples, this river continually running. For to the people of the desert there is no more miraculous and lovely thing on earth than the continually running water. In the most stirring episode of Saint Exupéry's Wind, Sand, and Stars, the Arab chiefs, who view the wonders of Paris with stolid indifference, burst into cries of devout rapture at the sight of a torrent in the Alps. When the Beni Hilal stopped at their first oasis, the beauty of it and the green vegetation reminded them again of the homeland they had left, and they wept greatly, remembering it. It was precisely because Lehman and Lemuel were loud in lamenting the loss of their pleasant land of Jerusalem and their precious things that their father was moved to address them on this particular occasion. If the earliest desert poems were songs inspired by the fair sight of running water, no one today knows the form they took. That can only be conjectured from the earliest known form of Semitic verse. This is the Shaj, a short exhortation or injunction spoken with such solemnity and fervor as to fall into a sort of chant. Examples would be magical incantations, curses, and the formal pronouncements of teachers and priests and judges. From the earliest times, the Saj was the form in which inspiration and revelation announced themselves, though the speaker of the Saj did not aim consciously at metrical form. His words were necessarily more than mere prose, and were received by their hearers as poetry. The Saj had the effect, we are told, of overawing the hearer completely, and was considered absolutely binding on the person to whom it was addressed, its aim being to compel action. Lehi's words to his sons take just this form of short, solemn, rhythmical appeal. The fact that the speech to Laman exactly matches that to his brother shows that we have here such a formal utterance as the Saj. So the may you run into the flowing water, and may you be as unmoving as the valley in keeping the commandments of God. So he's again showing that culturally all of this fits exactly into this. The proudest boast of the desert poet is, I utter a verse, and after it, its brother. For the consummation of the poetic art was to have two verses perfectly parallel in form and content. Few ever achieved this, and Ibn Qutayba observes that the usual verse is followed not by a brother, but at best by a cousin. Yet Lehi seems to have carried it off. Of the moral fervor and didactic intent of his recitation, there can be no doubt. The fact that Nephi recounts the episode in a record in which there is, as he says, only room for great essentials, shows what a deep impression it made upon him. In addressing his sons in what looks like a little song, Lehi is doing just what Isaiah does. See chapter 5, 1-7, when he speaks to Israel in a Shirat Dodi, a friendly chant, a popular song about a vine, which, once the hearer's attention has been won, turns to a very serious moral tirade. On another occasion, as we have noted, he employs the popular figure of the olive tree. The stock opening line of the old desert poems is, O my two beloved ones, or friends, an introduction which says Ibn Qutayba should be avoided, since only the ancients knew how to use it properly, uniting a gentle and natural manner with its grandiose and magnificent. Lehi's poem is an example of what is meant. He addresses his two sons separately, but each with a particular and typical Arabic vocative, O that thou, Ya Elitica, and describes the river and valley in terms of unsurpassed brevity and simplicity, and in the vague and sweeping manner of the real desert poets, of whom Burton says, There is a dreaminess of idea and a haze thrown over the object, infinitely attractive but indescribable. Lehi's language is of this simple, noble, but hazy kind. According to Richter, the best possible example of the primitive Arabic qasid, the name given to the oldest actual poetry of the desert, is furnished by these old poems, in which one's beloved is compared to land, in which abundant streams flow down, with rushing and swirling, so that the water overflows every evening continually. Here, the continually flowing water is compared to the person addressed, as Lehi's song to Lehman. The original qasid, the same authority avers, was built around the beseeching Werbenden, hence the name qasid, motif, not necessarily erotic in origin, as is once thought, but dealing rather with the praise of virtue in general. Tugendlob. Whew. I never knew there was so many different ways of addressing types of poetry and verse, and geez Louise, there's just, well, if that's what you have for entertainment, you don't exactly have radio or TV, so words are your way of going. Makes sense. Ibn Qutayba even claims that the introductory love theme was merely a device to gain attention of male listeners and was not at all the real stuff of poems. The standard pattern is a simple one. A, the poet's attention is arrested by some impressive natural phenomenon, usually running water. B, this leads him to recite a few words in its praise, drawing it the attention of a beloved companion of the way. And C, making it an object lesson for the latter, who is urged to be like it. Burton gives a good example at the sight of the Wadi al-Akik. The nomad poet is moved to exclaim, "O my friend, this Akik, then stand by it, endeavoring to be distracted by love, if not really a lover." This seems to be some sort of love song, albeit a peculiar one. My cats are playing tail tag. But Burton and his Arabs know the real meaning. The esoteric meaning of this couplet, as he calls it, which quite escapes the Western reader, and is to be interpreted, "Man, this is a lovely portion of God's creation. Then stand by it, and here learn to love the perfections of thy supreme friend. Compare this with Lehi's appeal to Lemuel. Oh, that thou mightest be like unto this valley, firm and steadfast, and immovable in keeping the commandments of the Lord." Note the remarkable parallel. In each case, the poet wandering in the desert with his friends is moved by the sight of a pleasant valley, a large wadi, with water in it. He calls the attention of his beloved companion to the view, and appeals to him to learn a lesson from the valley and stand by it, firm and unshakable in the love of the ways of the Lord. Let us briefly list the exacting conditions fulfilled by Nephi's account of his father's qasids, and demand of the true, authentic desert poet of the earliest period. They are Runen, or Quellenlieder, as the Germans call them. That is, songs inspired by the sight of water gushing from the spring or running down a valley. 2, they are addressed to one, or usually two, traveling companions. 3, they praise the beauty and the excellence of the scene, calling it to the attention of the hearer as an object lesson. 4, the hearer is urged to be like the thing he beholds. 5, the poems are recited extempore, on the spot and with great feeling. 6, they're very short, each couplet being a complete poem in itself. And 7, the verse must be followed by its brother, making a perfectly matched pair. Here we have, beyond any doubt, the elements of a situation which no Westerner in 1830 had the remotest conception. Lehi stands before us as something of a poet, as well as a great prophet and leader, and that is as it should be. The poetic art of David, says Professor Montgomery, has its complement in the early Arabic poets, some of whom themselves were kings. It has often been said that there is no real poetry in the Book of Mormon, no real English poetry, that is, And of course not. There is no Italian or Russian poetry either, for Lehi did not compose in those languages. Whenever Semitic poetry is translated into a modern language, if any attempt at all is made to retain the original meanings, the result is pretty awful. The Psalms are beautiful in English, for example, because the translators were very largely ignorant of the fine points of what they were reading, and so wrote a free and uninhibited English. And there's a footnote here that says, even the whole interpretation of the 23rd Psalm is now being questioned. So, there you go. But accuracy is the first and the last aim of our Book of Mormon text. And if there were any good poetry in the book, it would give just cause for suspicion. Stop with the... I don't mind you jumping up on things, but just watch the claws. Sorry for the distraction. They're cute little buggers. It would give the just cause for suspicion for Burton, even while praising the matchless genius of the desert poets, is careful to point out that what they are truly, they would point out that they are utterly destitute of the poetic taste as we define it. To Lehi's literary critics, we need only reply that Nephi is not supposed to be writing good English poetry, and that they might with equal justice maintain that there is no good literature in Mutanabi or the Kitab al-Aghani, because, forsooth, none of the innumerable poems contained in them has ever been done into great or even good English verse. They cannot be, and still contain, any of their original form or content. Yet those who know these books best insist that they represent the high point, not only in Arabic, but in also all lyric poetry. Guys, you need to know more Arabic poetry, can't you tell? As if to prove that no Westerner could possibly have dreamed up Nephi's account, we are challenged by the remarkable expression, like unto this valley, firm and steadfast and immovable. Who, west of Suez, would ever think of such an image? At the very least, the proofreader should have caught such a howler, which should certainly have been corrected in subsequent editions, for we, of course, know all about the everlasting hills and immovable mountains, and moving of which is the best-known illustrations of the infinite power of faith. But who ever heard of a steadfast valley? The Arabs, to be sure. For them, the valley, and not the mountain, is the symbol of permanence. I would agree with this. See springtime of this year in the Swiss Alps. It is not the mountain of refuge to which they flee, but the valley of refuge. The great depressions that run for hundreds of miles across the Arabian Peninsula pass for the most part through the plains devoid of mountains. It is in these ancient riverbeds alone that water, vegetation, and animal life are to be found when all else is desolation. They alone offer men and animals escape from their enemies and deliverance from death by hunger and thirst, the qualities of firmness and steadfastness, of reliable protection, refreshment, and sure refuge when all else fails, which other nations attribute naturally to mountains, the Arabs attribute to valleys. So, the ancient Zohar describes a party like Lehi's, quote, "And when they went down to the water, blue and still in its depression, they laid down their walking sticks like one who has reached a permanent resting place," unquote. So, now that is actually kind of really interesting, because I tend to think, just like all Westerners, that it's the mountains. You can even see this in modern movies. I, for one, love The Croods. Maybe it's because I'm a dad, but don't touch that. It's new. But in The Croods, they want to go to the mountains because the mountains mean safety, they mean peace, etc., right? Although what it turns out to be is a death trap for them, it turns out. And so it was to help them to get over the mountain to their new land of promise, out of the land that was being destroyed in the crudes. But you can see that mountains traditionally meant safety, peace. There's caves, things that they can hide in, things that they can hunker down in. That's what he was always used to, instead of freely roaming open where things could come and attack. And there's a lot to that. I think there's just so many good little parts about that show, and it's fun. But in the end, yeah, we think of mountains because we think in the Rocky Mountain West, we have a lot of very overpowered land. Let me back up a little bit. This is coming from, if you read Thomas Sowell's Conquests and Conquerors, one of the things that Thomas Sowell does is he goes into all these regions that have been conquered, and why were they conquered, and how were they conquered, and what was the results of the conquering. It's a dive into each of those. He goes into the England, because England kept getting run over by everybody. Even the Romans made it up into England, right? And then Vikings and all this other stuff. He goes into the Native Americans. He goes into Africa. He goes into all this other stuff. But what was interesting is when he talked about the African continent, he explained certain features of the geography itself cause Africa to have a lot of problems compared to other countries. Because the whole continent of Africa is kind of uplifted out of the ocean, there's very few spots along the coast of Africa that have good harbors. Like a lot of low-lying countries where you have big plains and such, and water can drain into the ocean. You have harbors, you have navigable rivers, etc. If you want to be a place of power, you have to often have a place where you can trade. This is why Egypt was so important. This is one of the spots that you have the Nile River. In this case, it flows northward up into the Delta and into the Mediterranean. And because it's nice and low, you can then travel off into the east over the Sinai Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, up into the Central European area or the original Asia area, through Turkey and such, where you can go into the Mediterranean and start trading along there, which there you have the Greeks and the Italians, etc., all along the Mediterranean coasts, which again, you can see the visceral differences between these different cultures according to their landscape. But if you go away from Egypt, there's usually a big uplift right at the shoreline of Africa. And so, navigable rivers? Really? What's that? Right? They don't have much of that. The Niger River, if you ever look at a map, it does this spiral around until it comes out. And the only times that it's navigable, because it loses so much elevation, because again, there is this huge uplift, and it's constantly losing a lot of elevation, which means like if you go up into the mountain rivers here in the Mountain West, you go to a mountain river, it's nothing but a stream, right? Going over rocks. It's very, generally, fairly shallow, because at no point does it get to an area that it has scoured out a nice, slow, deep, flat basin until it reaches down into the valleys. So if you're constantly losing elevation swiftly, you have narrow, fast-moving rivers, or, if it is slowed down, shallow. And you can't navigate ships up shallow rivers, especially going uphill, very easily. So Thomas Sowell points this out. And then he also points out another feature about Africa that makes it really hard. Despite this uplift of kind of like the whole rest of the continent and its edges, for the most part, and the lack of navigable rivers into all sorts of different interior areas of Africa, you also have a lack of mountain ranges that are high enough and prominent enough to accumulate snow. The reason this is important is because, well, if you have rivers that are able to be navigated up, not only do you have to use shallow bottom boats, but you have to wait until it is flowing, which only would come when the rainy season comes, which can be variable from year to year. Whereas if you have mountains, they act like a big refrigerator. They store all the waters up at the top of the mountains, and they slowly melt over time, continually giving water into the rivers so that they stay always running throughout time. This is why I'm sure there's a bunch of videos on YouTube that talk about how America is hacks. They're the ones who are like unstoppable. They have the whole Mississippi. Yeah, we've got the Mississippi and Missouri River basins that flow into each other that allows access to like the almost huge entirety of the East. And there are other, over the Appalachian Mountains, a bunch of different river basins on the east that flow to the east. But the whole river basin going into the Mississippi is massive. And a lot of that is navigable rivers. So you have trade and commerce and being able to go up and down the rivers and get deep into the whole country. And so there's the benefits is the trade and travel that can be done along those rivers. It is also a boundary which you have to cross if you are trying to get across it instead of up or down it. But it is a huge benefit, followed by which we've got the Rocky Mountains going right through the western half of the country from as far east as North and South Dakota, and then you've got Colorado and such. So the western half of the Dakotas and Colorado, and then all the way, it depends on how you want to view it. If you can break things down like into the Wasatch Mountains, the Uinta Mountains, the Sierra Nevadas, but it's really just kind of rocky all the way till Utah, right? It kind of includes all of Utah. Nevada, if you ever go over in a plane, it's just full of all these ridges. It's very desert-like, so it's not huge uplift of mountains, but it's still very ridge-like. Like it just got compacted. And then you have the Sierra Nevadas, the mountains that just make the border between Nevada and California. The ones that have Mount Whitney, that have Yosemite, that just, again, it feeds California all the water that it needs. And so all of that is mountainous. So there is a lot to be said about geography, and there is a lot to be said about why we as Westerners, and we get our culture as Westerners from England, and England got it from everyone who invaded them, and especially the Romans, and the Romans got it from the Greeks. So, and this is how we learn Western history, is we trace it back through England and then Rome and Greece. It's just how we learn. And so for Rome and Greece, they had mountains that had water. They acted as refrigerators. They acted as the place where the water comes from to continually have rivers flowing. You go to the Arabs in the desert, tain't no snow on them mountains. They got water that'll come down, well, maybe once in a while. There are some mountains, I'm sure, but just the idea of it continually being there, not only are they in the lower latitudes, which makes it harder for snow to accumulate during winter or cold times, but it also means that really it just depends on when the rain is falling on the different parts of the Arabian Desert, if any. So, yeah, valleys, you go up into the mountains there, it's nothing but like rocks and maybe moss. I'm no expert on the Arabian Desert, but yeah, elevated deserts are a funky thing because you go into the steppes, National Geographic stuff, you get things like grasslands and whatnot in the steppes and plains of Tibet, and then you have just the Great Basin in the elevated areas of the Colorado Plateau, which is really the Four Corners area. I don't see why it's called the Colorado Plateau. It's more like the Four Corners Plateau of all the four states, but elevated deserts weird things happen ecologically. I don't know how elevated the Arabian Peninsula is. It might be just low-lying desert. That just may mean that all the water and life-giving stuff is all in the valleys and not on the mountains, which makes a huge difference. Okay, there's your geography lesson, along with why it makes so much sense that they have poetry about valleys and rivers, and how that is perfectly in line with Arabian culture. Adventure in Jerusalem. I need to be mindful of my time here. Let me see how much we got. Oh, dude, we could finish off this whole chapter. Yeah, let's do it. Adventure in Jerusalem. Nephi and his brothers made 2 trips back to Jerusalem. The second was only to the land of Jerusalem to pick up Ishmael. The fact that this was a simple and uncomplicated mission at the time, when things would have been very hot for the brethren in the city itself, where they had been chased by Laban's police on their former expedition, and would be instantly recognized, although I would say not his police, but his personal guards, because he was commander and captain. I don't think there was anything akin to a police force until much later, because I think everyone had their own private guards and armies. Because, yeah, just a different concept. But anyways, you get the point. Where they had been chased by Laban's police force on their former expedition and would be instantly recognized, implies that Ishmael, like Lehi, lived well out in the country. See 1 Nephi 7, 2-5. Hello. But the first mission was an exciting and dangerous assignment in the city itself, though it was no mere raid, as we have seen. The men, taking their tents with them and going up quite openly, they were expecting trouble and drew lots to see who should go into Laban. The record tells of hiding without the walls, daring exploits in dark streets, mad pursuits, dangerous masquerading, desperate deeds, and bitter quarrels. Sorry, you can't be up near my painting stuff. The typical Oriental romance, one might say, but typical because such things are actually do and always did happen in Eastern cities. It has ever been an established and conventional bit of gallantry for some Bedouin bravo with a piece on his head to risk his life by walking right through a city under the noses of the police in broad daylight. A very theatrical gesture, but one which my Arab friends assure me has been done 1,000 times. It was, while reading the Beni Hillel epic, that the writer was first impressed by the close resemblance of the behavior of Lehi's sons on that quick trip to Jerusalem, that the young braves of the Beni Hillel, when they would visit the city under like circumstances. The tales of wanderings of the Amur tribe tell the same story, camping without the walls, drawing lots to see who would take a chance, sneaking into the city, and making a getaway through the midnight streets. It is all in the Book of Mormon and quite authentic. Thoroughly typical also is the hiding out of the young men in caves near the city when they waited for Laban's henchmen to cool off and debated with Oriental heat and passion their next move, in 1 Nephi 3, 27-28. Since the Palestine Exploration Fund Quarterly started to appear many years ago, its readers have been treated to a constant flow of official reports on newly discovered caves in and near Jerusalem. The country is peppered with them. For the area southwest of the city, it is difficult to give an account of the principal excavations of this type of caves. It would all be together futile, the mere labor of searching the hills for examples, but be almost endless. Farther out, the Beit Jibrin area contains an innumerable number of artificial caves. In the desert of Tyre and Moab swarm. It's going to take me a second to change page. Swarm with them. Many of these caves, being artificial, are younger than Lehi's time, but many are also older and to have been used, at times, as hiding places. But who in America knew of these hiding places 100 years ago. The purpose of the first return trip to Jerusalem was the procuring of certain records, which were written on bronze plates. The Book of Mormon, like the Bible, was always uses brass, but for what we call bronze. Oh, interesting. That I didn't know. So they weren't brass. Okay, so yeah, the brass instruments section. It'd be bronze, so it'd be much more. Oh, God, good golly, now I need to think about that. What do bronze plates look like? I always imagine them as being more of a dark brown kind of plates. Anyway, you guys settle down. You're warm. A word that has become current only since its translation. Lehi had a dream in which he was commanded to get these records, which, as he already knew, were kept at the house of one Laban. Nephi does not know exactly the reason for this and assumes incorrectly that it turned out that the object was to preserve unto our children the language of our fathers. It is interesting that the Beni Halal, in setting out for their great trek, felt it necessary to keep a record of their fathers and to add it to it as they went, so that the memory of it might remain for future generations. The keeping of such a daftar, as it was called, was also known to other wandering tribes. But what were the records doing at Laban's house, and who was Laban anyway? And this is where you should see Don Bradley, as well as Jonah Barnes. Just saying. And even Dave Butler, too. Okay. Dealings with Laban. For ages, the cities of Palestine and Syria had been more or less under the rule of military governors, of native blood, but, in theory at least, answerable to Egypt. These commandants, called rabbis in the Amarna letters, were subordinate to the city princes, Chazan, who commonly addressed them as brother or father. They were, by and large, a sordid lot of careerists whose authority depended on constant deception and intrigue. Though they regarded their offices as hereditary and sometimes styled themselves kings, in the Amarna, I'm saying it wrong, Amarna letters, we find these men raiding each other's caravans, accusing each other of unpaid debts and broken promises, mutually denouncing each other as traitors to Egypt, and generally displaying the usual time-honored traits of the high officials in the East, seeking before all things to increase his private fortune. I would say this is true of any politician. The Lachish letters show that such men were still the lords of creation in Lehi's day. The commanders of towns around Jerusalem were still acting in closest cooperation with Egypt in military matters, depending on the prestige of Egypt to bolster their corrupt power, and still behaving as groveling and unscrupulous themselves. Unscrupulous time servers. That's another good way to just call out any politician. One of the main functions of any governor in the East has always been to hear petitions, and the established practice has never, ever been to rob the petitioners or anyone else whenever possible. The eloquent peasant story of 15 centuries before Lehi and the innumerable tales of the Qadis of 15 centuries after him are all part of the same picture, and Laban fits into that picture as if it were drawn to set off his portrait. Quote, and Laban went into the house of Laban, and he talked with him as he sat in his house, and desired of Laban the records which were engraven upon the plates of brass, which contained the genealogy of my father. And Laban was angry and thrust him out of his presence, and he would not that he should have the records. Wherefore he said unto him, Behold, thou art a robber, and I will slay thee. But Laban fled out of his presence, and told the things which Laban had done unto us. That's 1 Nephi 3:11-14. Later, the brothers returned to Laban, laden with their family treasure, foolishly hoping to buy the plates for him. They might have known what would happen. And it came to pass that when Laban saw our property, and that it was exceeding great, he did lust after it, insomuch that he thrust us out, and sent his servants to slay us, that he might obtain our property. And it came to pass that we did flee before the servants of Laban, and we were obliged to leave behind our property, and it fell to the hands of Laban. Again, that's chapter 3, verse 25 through 26. Or, they sent the HOA Karens to strip us of our rights and our property. Sorry. Compare this with like I said, if you haven't listened through everything else, the best people we've met had the actual name of Karen. We're wonderful people. Whereas the people who are the worst and are the most demanding and self-involved and, those kind of people, they are not named Karen. Compare this with the now classic story of Wennemann's interview